Thank you very much.
Now, I think I would like to invite Professor Diego from School of Electrical Engineering and Mines to introduce the next speaker, who is actually Tom D. Aquino from Vector AI.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is, as Prakash mentioned, is Diego Fregolente. I'm coming from University of Maryland. I just joined SIX. So my research is information diffusion. So I try to understand how information propagates in online social networks. Basically, I use a lot of modeling and data analysis to understand how real news and fake news propagates. So that's about me. So let me introduce the next speaker. The next speaker is Tom D'Aquino. The title of his talk is Understanding Haptic Threat Model Prototyping for Testing Threat Detection Efficacy. And Tom is the founder and lead developer at Havoc, an open source adversary emulation as code platform and framework. In his professional life, Tom has over 20 years of experience working with cybersecurity industry and is currently employed by Vector AI as the director of security validation. And in his role with Vector AI, Tom has unique opportunity of performing live fire testing with novel AI-based behaviors detection capabilities that Vector AI has pioneering performance. Tom, please, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Diego. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Appreciate that. Thanks for the great introduction. Thanks, Prakash, as well. And happy Halloween to everyone. Thanks for joining me for this session. I know we're a little bit early to say happy Halloween, but I'm certainly already digging into the candy around our house, so I guess that counts, right? I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and hopefully walk you guys through a presentation that covers the topics that Diego just mentioned. Okay, here we go. So as I said, we're talking about using rapid threat model prototyping for testing threat detection efficacy. I'll get into what that means in a few minutes, but first, let me give you a little bit of background about me. So as Diego mentioned, I'm the director of security validation at Vector AI. Basically, that means that I get to poke and prod at our product, our platform, our detection capabilities, and make sure that the system, the overall platform, does what it's supposed to do in terms of actually detecting the threats that we put in front of it. So that's my day-to-day responsibility. I do that with in real customer environments as well as in lab environments. I work closely with our security research and data science teams in order to continually push the envelope of improving our capabilities there. Somewhere in the past few years, I've had the opportunity to also develop a platform that I use for this testing purpose. I call it Havoc. And Havoc is an open source tool. You can find more about it at havoc.sh, as well as on github.com at github.com/havoc.sh. And there's also a Slack community that's not terribly active at the moment, but in the next few weeks, I expect that's going to pick up because I'm going to start getting more active myself there. If you'd like to connect with me on LinkedIn, this is my LinkedIn profile. Please do. I'll be happy to accept your connection request. I've not been as active on LinkedIn of late because I found that they don't do a great job promoting content, that like their algorithms are prioritized around promoting selfies and and rants as opposed to constructive information that consists of references and external links and things like that, which is the kind of content that I tend to push out. So I think I'll find myself in my own Slack community sharing my opinions more often these days. But anyway, feel free to connect there if you're interested. Let's sorry about that, get rid of this thing. Not sure what happened there. Let's get into what we mean by threat detection efficacy. So objectives of security validation, this is threat detection efficacy is synonymous with security validation. You'll hear also terms like breach and attack simulation. All of these things kind of fall into the same bucket, if you will. Basically, they're becoming more of a commercialized approach to the things we used to do in the past with just, you know, very manual pen testing or red team engagements, right? And you know, we're trying to find as an industry ways to be more you know, sort of proactive with this, and not just proactive but more frequent, right? One of the challenges with you know, red team engagements, penetration testing activities is that they tend to be very, very infrequent. And so we're relying on software and you know, some automation capabilities to improve the frequency with which we can do these kinds of tests. And that's really where, you know, Havoc comes into play. It's really an automation framework that allows you to do this, but there are other products out there, some commercial, some other open source tools that are very useful for this purpose. And so to that end, what questions are we trying to answer? I've kind of detailed them here. So for the sake of this talk, you know, I'm really focusing on advanced attackers. So can we detect advanced attacker TTPs? I'm going to make probably some disparaging remarks about various security validation approaches or techniques that are out there. That's not to say that they won't work at all. It's just, you know, for the context of this talk, where I'm focusing on advanced attackers, they're not very effective for that purpose. So if you're talking about validating the ability to prevent or block you know, well-known threats, then that's a perfectly fine conversation to have around many of the tactics that I'm going to disparage here. But when it comes to advanced attackers, wholly ineffective. And so that's why I feel personally that we need to really dig into this topic and make sure that you know, everyone that's engaging in this kind of activity is clear about why they're doing it and how they're doing it. Okay, so as we push along and try to answer these questions, you know, focusing on advanced attacker TTPs, as we're doing the testing, we need to ensure that the detections associated with their activities end up where they're supposed to, or they, you know, making their way to a SIM. Will the associated entities, whether they're hosts or accounts that are associated with the attack, are they being prioritized appropriately so that you know, they're coming up to the top of the list of things that an investigator needs to be spending time on? And then as they're doing that, do we have enough information to respond appropriately? So, you know, assuming that an attack is prioritized, do we have the details and the events or alerts that have been prioritized to make sure that we can take a proper response action? And then, you know, the sort of final piece of that is, what are the response actions that are necessary to contain a breach by an advanced attacker? So this is going to be wholly different from containing a breach or an attempted compromise of some sort, where, you know, there's well-known payloads or well-known exploits involved. Like, these things often can be prevented and blocked. And so, you know, in this scenario where that, you know, initial prevention isn't taking place, you know, what more needs to be done in order to actually contain this attacker? And that tends to be far more complex than most people often realize. Okay, so you know, I've already mentioned our emphasis here is on defending against advanced adversaries. Well, what does that mean exactly? Well, we're assuming that preventative controls will be bypassed, right? They're going to use things like zero-day exploits. They're going to use evasive payloads, traffic profiles, and infrastructure. What I mean by that is payloads that, you know, implants or malicious software of some sort that is going to evade any kind of antivirus or endpoint detection and response capabilities. Oftentimes they're resulting to using sort of trusted administrative utilities that are, you know, intentionally not blocked by AV or EDR because they're used legitimately for administrative purposes. Well, if they're used by folks with bad intentions, then that isn't necessarily something that we want in the environment, right? But oftentimes those utilities will be allowed in anyway. Evasive traffic profiles, we're talking about C2 communications, where the attacker sort of controls both ends of the communication. So they've got the client, they're able to manipulate the client into communicating in a certain structure. They control the server side of this communication, so they can be very specific about what they want the requests and responses to look like. For example, I use a framework that, and in fact, this is popularized by the Cobalt Strike C2 platform, which has the ability to emulate, to make the C2 channel look like pretty much any kind of traffic you want. If you want your C2 session to look like Windows Update, easy enough, right? It's a very, very simple thing to pull off. And so, those evasive techniques from a communication standpoint, very effective for an attacker to slide under the radar, bypass preventative controls, things like that. And same thing on the infrastructure side. They're going to roll new infrastructure on a regular basis. We can't assume that, threat intelligence is necessarily going to catch the C2 server, for example, that they're leveraging to communicate with a machine inside of the environment. The other thing is we're going to assume that advanced adversaries are opportunistic. They're adaptive in their attack techniques. So this basically means, whatever path of entry they can follow into their target environment, they will follow it. They're not going to come at this from the perspective of like, oh, we have one attack technique, and if that doesn't work, then we give up. They're called advanced persistent threats for a reason, that persistent word being the key. That's they're going to continue to push until they find a path that opens up to them, right? And so they're going to be opportunistic in that respect. They're going to adapt their techniques in order to find their way in. And so, with those, sort of implications in place, we need to sort of adjust our strategy for this type of adversary, which is to focus on post-compromise detection. So for the sake of doing security validation, and breach and attack simulation, however you want to refer to it as, the efficacy around post-compromise detection is really our top priority. Can we detect one of these adversaries when they're in our environment? So, just looking at signature-based solutions, usually not sufficient for detecting one of these adversaries, and for the reasons that I've already described. If they can bypass preventative controls, it's a pretty safe assumption that they're going to bypass any signature-based detection capability as well. I mean, if we could detect them with the signature, then we could probably just implement that signature in a way that would block or prevent them from pulling their actions or activities in the environment in the first place. So with that in mind, if we're not talking about signature-based solutions, well, then what kind of capabilities are we talking about, and how do we perform efficacy testing against them? And this is really where my role at Vectra kind of gave me an opportunity to see things in a new light. So when we're talking about AI-based and behavioral-based detection capabilities, the methods that you use to do efficacy testing against those types of platforms is dramatically different from what you would use to validate the capabilities of a signature-based platform, right? So we find AI and behavioral-based capabilities to be highly effective at detecting these types of advanced adversaries, but we need to make sure that they're working when we deploy them, right? Another tactic that I've found to be extremely effective is using traps and tripwires, right? So this is a low-tech solution here, actually, a capability that really doesn't cost a lot from a technology standpoint. It's pretty simple to implement, but also pretty effective. And that is, creating things like fake accounts in the environment. If you, create a fake account and in some manner expose the credentials to that account inside of the environment, maybe put the credentials in a PowerShell script and put them on an admin share that's public, that's accessible to everybody in the organization. And that might seem like a big no-no, but this is what attackers are looking for. So just give it to them, right? Except give them a variation of it that is being closely monitored. So make sure that the account that you're exposing in this way doesn't have any special privileges in the environment, that the account is locked, and that you have very aggressive auditing associated with it, right? So the second somebody finds those credentials and tries to make use of that account, we're going to see, some kind of alert bubble right up to the top of our prioritization list, because we know really any legitimate activity in the environment is not going to be leveraging that account. So those types of traps and tripwires, you can do the same thing with documents, create a fake share. A share that's legitimately accessible, but not actually applicable to any business need within the organization. You put a share up, put some documents in it, put really aggressive auditing on those files, and the second somebody starts interacting with them, that's a tripwire that they've kicked that lets you know, like, hey, somebody is in the environment, kind of poking and prodding at things they shouldn't be. So let's go figure out who this is. Again, very low tech, very cost effective, but also highly effective for sort of stuffing out those adversaries when they're in the environment poking and prodding around, right? So the trouble with this approach is just because the tripwires are there, there's no guarantee that an attacker is going to trip over them, right? So we need to have some other type of capability in there, and that's where the AI-based and behavioral-based detection capabilities come in. Okay, so that's some of the background. The current non-planning approach is what I like to refer to it as, like the common approach that most folks are using to do any kind of efficacy testing or security validation tends to start with breach headlines. So you'll see some company get breached. There's a very public very public set of content that comes out, or presentation about it, that hey, these are the TTPs associated with this threat actor, that how they got into this particular organization, et cetera, et cetera. And so you get all this information, and the typical reaction to that from security teams around the globe that are not affiliated with the organization that was breached is, well, what if that happens to us, right? And so then they go into this exercise of like, let's gather the TTPs associated with this big headline. Let's conduct a tabletop exercise, identify what our priorities are, and then we'll go test those prioritized TTPs. And so this is, what I was talking about earlier. When you go through this process, you end up typically focusing on testing, known exploits, known bad artifacts. These are all things that are oriented around preventative controls. And so that's fine for, going through that exercise of making sure that, the preventative controls that we have in our environment are doing their job in terms of blocking well-known, bad artifacts and exploits and et cetera. But, when it comes to advanced adversaries, I'm going to be, no, this isn't going to be effective. So first off, I'm just generally not a fan of reactionary approaches, in particular where there is the ability to be proactive in lieu of being reactive, right? An incident response scenario, you have to be reactive. There's no other option there other than hopefully you avoid the breach in the first place, right? Which is why we're doing this kind of testing. But ultimately, incident response is, if it happens, you have to react, right? There's no other option. At the point where we're trying to do testing, rather than being reactionary, we should be proactive. We should be trying to identify the types of things that we're going to be concerned about ahead of time, and then go test for those first, rather than waiting for some headline to direct our activities, right? So that's the first issue. The scope of TTPs is too narrow is kind of the second concern here. So when you end up like identifying priorities and then narrowing your your TTPs down to what those priorities are, you're going to find yourself missing a lot of opportunities to detect adversarial behavior. So, narrowing the scope, while it might seem like a good idea in terms of making the effort, manageable, you end up missing a lot of opportunities. And then in the previous slide, maybe I agreed with myself, but for sake of argument here, I'm going to say that we agreed that advanced adversaries are going to bypass preventative controls, right? And so if we're focusing on known exploits, known bad artifacts, that are oriented around preventative controls, well, then we kind of have to assume that by the time this attacker hits our environment, they're going to be using, something different with respect to their payloads, their, whatever tactics they're employing, and we can't assume that those preventative controls are going to catch, right? And then we also agreed that advanced adversaries are opportunistic, and so when you look at a TTP, a set of TTPs associated with a headline, that was sort of what worked for that particular target organization, right? That's what allowed them to get in there. But to assume that this is sort of the tail wagging the dog, right? Where you're saying like, this is how they got in, so we need to make sure that people can't get in using those same tactics. Well, okay, that's fine, but that should be built into your normal part of your security operations management, which is we're constantly patching vulnerabilities and locking down configuration weaknesses and exposures and things like that. Like, that's an ongoing process anyway. But in terms of assuming that those same TTPs are going to be leveraged to attack your environment is, at the point where those are locked down, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're safe from this attacker, right? They're going to find another path, most likely. So the point is, you've got to make sure that if they do find another way in, that you can actually detect their presence. The last thing I'll harp on here is the concept of attack samples and replays. So a lot of the breach and attack simulation space is really focused on using discrete, isolated tests for doing security validation or breach and attack simulation. So they'll use a sample, which is something like a short C2 session that might last 2 or 3 minutes, basically mimics the requests and responses of a well-known C2 traffic profile. So maybe there's a particular type of malware that communicates with a command and control server, and that malware has been profiled. They've dissected it 6 ways till Sunday. They understand how it communicates with its C2 server, and so they'll look to replicate that in an environment and basically run it for a couple of minutes and see if something in the environment is able to block it or detect it. And in signature-based solutions, that's fine, because what you end up with is a sequence of bits and bytes that the malware would put onto the network. We're going to replicate that, and a signature-based solution is looking typically for a small string or a small subset of data that it knows is bad, and it can catch on that and trigger a detection, and that's fine. But in the case of AI-based solutions, they tend to be more holistic in nature. They're not looking for a few bits or bytes. They're looking at some other criteria that's more expansive to identify, is this a real C2 session? So for example, in the case of Vectra, we can do command and control tunnel detection of HTTPS traffic. So let's say, for example, an attacker is using a hidden tunnel via HTTPS. We can detect that without actually doing any decryption of the HTTPS traffic. And we can do that because we're looking at the profile of communications. A hidden tunnel via HTTPS looks, we'll say, fairly different from normal web browsing traffic through HTTPS. And so we can detect the beaconing, we can detect the sort of command and the command request and the control response and all of that, sort of back and forth, we can see that activity based on the data profile of the session. But it takes, a real C2 session being alive in the environment for more than a couple of minutes for the algorithms to decide, yeah, this is actually a real attack. And that's, I think, the distinction here. We're talking about, fake attacks versus real attacks. And AI platforms, if they're designed properly, aren't trying to detect fake attacks. They're trying to detect actual, real, legitimate attack or adversaries in the environment, attack activity in the environment. So that's really what the key distinction is there. Example of a replay might be replaying a PCAP of a previously recorded session, and in that recorded session, somebody executed an SMB exec attack, for example, where some process was launched from one machine to another, a connection is made over SMB, and a call is issued to execute a process on the remote machine. In that type of scenario, if you're doing this with a PCAP where you're just replaying that traffic, you're really going to be talking about machines and accounts and domains that aren't relevant to the production environment being monitored. And so the challenge there is, if you have a properly designed AI system, it's going to recognize that this traffic has absolutely nothing to do with the actual production environment that's being monitored. And so just replaying something that was previously recorded is, we'll say it's not necessarily that the system is calling out that this is fake traffic, but the traffic doesn't meet the criteria required for the AI model to say, hey, yeah, this is actually an attack against the environment we're monitoring. And so it's not gonna be sufficient to trigger that model to say, hey, this is something that you should be concerned about. The other problem with these types of replaying techniques is that the traffic is constrained to only the hosts that the breach and attack simulation platform controls. And so if you're talking about something like a port scan, you're talking about something like, domain reconnaissance, domain-based reconnaissance, that kind of activity has to happen against the actual production environment. So let's say you wanted to simulate the process of doing some domain reconnaissance. Well, you can't do that against a fake domain when you're talking about an AI-based solution. An AI-based solution is going to recognize the domain that it's monitoring. It's going to build a profile for that domain. It's going to build a profile for the accounts within that domain and what's normal in terms of the types of calls that they make, the types of services they're interacting with. A properly designed AI system will have a lot of detail in that respect. And so if you want to assess that platform's ability to actually detect reconnaissance against a domain, for example, you have to interact with the domain. You have to actually recon the domain. Otherwise, it's not going to show up from an algorithmic perspective. It's not going to be anything significant to the AI-based solution, right? So doing something between just a couple of constrained hosts that aren't actually participating in domain activity and whatnot, not sufficient for testing and validating these types of capabilities. Okay, so what do I suggest we do instead? Well, the first thing is we need to model the environment that we're working with, and that's where the rapid threat model prototyping comes into play. And I've spent a lot of time sort of setting the stage here, so I really need to plow through the remainder of this stuff. So I'm going to try to pick up the pace here, but basically the rapid threat model prototyping process is a 4-step process, starting with modeling the system, right? So summarize the environment, understand from a high-level architectural standpoint what the traffic flows look like. So where does traffic originate? Where does it end up? And in the RTMP sort of lexicon, we talk about these things as sources and sinks. So where is an attack potentially going to originate, and what is the target of value that is going to be targeted? The attack origin is the source, the target of value is the sink, So you go through this sort of high-level architecture of the environment, and then identify those attack sources and sinks. And then you analyze the threats associated with them. So my recommendation for how to do this is to create an attack tree, and I'll show you what that looks like in a few moments. Relevant to the tech that's being tested. So if you're trying to validate EDR-based capabilities, then you need to focus on attack trees that are, down at the endpoint level. But if you're trying to validate network-based technologies, then you need to focus on an attack tree that's on the network side, right? And if you're focused on network prevention controls that are at the perimeter, then your attack tree needs to be oriented around, perimeter-based activity. But in the case of like Vectra's capabilities, we do a lot of east-west monitoring, east-west traffic monitoring, so deep down in the data center. And if you're, focusing on analyzing threats that are at the perimeter, then you're not going to get to that point of testing the efficacy of what's happening deep down in the data center, right? So you've got to make sure that you're applying your threat analysis in the right place. And then once you have that attack tree mapped out, you basically map that to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And then from there, use the MITRE ATT&CK, TTPs that are defined for the various tactics, and or the MITRE ATT&CK techniques that are defined for the various tactics, and make those the basis for your testing. And once you have, those detailed tactics and techniques, then you can start to dive in and identify what your mitigations are. So what are the opportunities for detecting these types of techniques? How do we make sure that we can elevate the capabilities in that respect? And then the fourth step is really to validate. So let's take everything we've learned from those first three steps and try our best to emulate those TTPs in a real world manner, right? So if we're talking about, particular command and control technique, it's not enough to just put the C2 traffic on the wire for a few minutes. You've got to go in and actually use that C2 session, use it the way an attacker would use it, to do local host reconnaissance, to do network-based reconnaissance, to try to move laterally, direct all of that through your C2 session, right? So that's what I mean by emulate TTPs and as close to a real-world manner as possible. Once you've done that, confirm the traffic flows or confirm the, log data, whatever's supposed to be generated as a result of these TTPs being in the environment. Confirm that data is in fact in place and that it's getting where it needs to go. You're reviewing the detections that are surfacing as a result of that data being present. Confirm your event pipeline. So are the detections going where they're supposed to go? Are they, prioritized accordingly? Are they, showing up in dashboards and reports where they're supposed to? All of that stuff. Okay, so when it comes to modeling the system, this is an example environment that I'm working with here. I'll run through this really quickly. Basically, we're talking about a multi-campus network, a few data centers. And in this particular environment, they've got your standard corporate IT stuff, right? So Active Directory domain with file and print services, finance and HR applications, customer data analytics, engineering and development infrastructure, your typical IT infrastructure. And then there's also, typically in an organization like this, there's going to be some kind of production services environment, something that's exposed to customers, support resources, web services, things like that. And it's important to differentiate between these two different environments and identify, well, what's in scope for our testing for this particular exercise, right? And you need to treat these things differently because they're going to have, very different attack profiles or threat profiles associated with them, right? So make sure that, you address them accordingly. So for the corporate IT environment that we're focusing on here in this example, we're talking about a pretty controlled, like very structured architecture, right? So there's a tiered administration model, basically works in. I use this because I wanted to use an example where we're talking about something that is relatively well formed from a security architecture standpoint. We're not talking about an organization that's super lax or not very disciplined in how they architected the environment. And even in these scenarios, you'll still find where it's a well-formed security architecture that's there's still paths in for the adversary, right? So you still need to engage in this kind of assessment. But in this particular case, this was based off of Palantir blog. You can see the reference down here, blog.palantir.com. This is a legitimate architecture that Palantir uses, and they talk about it publicly. So that's why I pulled that in and used this as a, or use that as a reference for our example architecture here, because basically what we're talking about is, you know, an environment where they've gone through lots of testing like this, and come up with various solutions to try to contain an attacker that might actually make their way into the environment. So that's a really interesting read. I'd highly recommend following this kind of architecture if at all possible. The basic gist of it is, you know, having multiple tiers where the lowest tier are your workstations, the middle tier are, you know, your servers, you know, basic servers that people need to use and interact with. And then the tier 0 is your authentication servers and IT infrastructure, the things that are, you know, really critical to the stability of the environment. We'll call out the administrative ports. So what specifically are the things that are used in the environment to manage systems? There's RDP and WinRM is typical, right? And these are restricted to bastion hosts for each tier. So each one of these tiers has a bastion host that is allowed to perform this type of activity. Everything else is basically locked down from a local Windows firewall perspective. So for example, a workstation in the tier 2 environment can't communicate with other workstations over RDP or WinRM or even SMB. Like you can really lock that all down using local firewall rules. And then access to each tier is restricted to users assigned to their tier. So, you know, you'll have a username associated with the tier, MFA in place for all of them. The tier 2, the lowest tier, they're going to have just sort of standard usernames. But if you want to elevate or access a machine in the second tier, then you need to use a username that's tied to that tier plus MFA to be able to log into it, et cetera, right? And so, you know, there's, you know, basically all of these controls in place to make it very, very difficult for lateral movement to take place. So if an adversary were to get access to one of these tier 2 workstations, they're not going to have a lot of paths available to them in terms of protocols, SMB, for example, or WinRM that they can use to try to move laterally to another workstation or server, another workstation in that tier or server in the next tier. In modeling the environment, you're also looking at the types of traffic, inbound, outbound traffic, what's permitted, what's not permitted, and where these things can originate from. And the net effect is when you've defined that and your sources and sinks, you ultimately can build a diagram that gives you a really clear picture of how traffic flows, right? So we're going to identify our sources as, you know, the workstations, remote users, trusted applications, via supply chain risk, right? So these are all the places where an attack can originate. The sinks are going to be basically anything in our enterprise IT environment, the production services environment. These are the things that folks are going to be, an attacker is going to be trying to get access to, right? So this is what the architecture, the high level architecture will end up looking like. You know, you've got your various, you know, tier 1 hosts here. Your tier 2 and tier 3 stuff is all down here. So the tier 2 is everything in blue. The tier 3 is everything in red, or I'm sorry, tier 0 is everything in red, tier 1 is everything in blue, and then tier 2 is everything in green. So that the lowest tier is your like workstation stuff, your remote users, et cetera. The middle tier is the finance, HR, customer data, et cetera. And then your top tier is the IT infrastructure and authentication servers, things like that. Okay, so with that identified, we can start to analyze the threats. And this is where the attack tree piece comes in. So if you're to look at those sources and sinks and evaluate, well, what's really the opportunity for an attacker here that's going to be most sort of detrimental to this type of environment. You know, a workstation getting compromised or a remote user getting compromised, the impact of that is going to be relatively low because they're going to have limited access into the environment. So the most significant impact in this type of organization really is going to be the trusted applications via supply chain risk. So we're kind of assuming that, you know, something in tier 1 or tier 0 is going to have, you know, some embedded malicious code in it or something that's going to grant the threat actor access to more stuff in the environment than they would be able to access if they, for example, compromised a host inside of the tier 2 infrastructure, right? So that's what we're focusing on from an attack tree standpoint. We're assuming some IT infrastructure applications or something has been compromised via supply chain. Once the attacker has that control, they're going to, or that access, they're going to establish command and control. They're going to recon the network. They're going to gather data. They're going to attempt to get credentials and move laterally. And then from there, as they move laterally, they're going to start accessing other data. They're again going to repeat that process of reconning the network, gathering data. And so in terms of, you know, their ability to move laterally, the things that are exposed that are going to allow them to do that from, you know, this IT infrastructure and applications probably going to be contained within, you know, this set of additional components in the environment. And that's just based on the way that the you know, segmentation is in place in the environment. So they're going to be restricted in terms of where they can move laterally to, but we have to assume that some of that lateral movement can take place. And then from there, they'll be able to access other things, right? So they're going to recon the network again. They're going to gather more data. And ultimately, they'll consolidate and exfil that data out of the environment, right? So at the point where you have, you know, this attack tree established, it's already kind of looking really similar to what the MITRE attack tactics look like, right? So we establish command and control. Well, there's a MITRE attack tactic called command and control, right? And then recon is, you know, mapping to discovery, gathering data, maps to collection, move laterally, maps to a category called lateral movement, right? So basically, we just make sure that we're understanding what are the MITRE attack tactics that's or categories that we really need to focus on. And then from there, you know, based on what we've already identified from our sources and sinks, the protocols that are allowed in the environment, we can start to dive into the underlying techniques. So for command and control, pretty much based on the restrictions within this environment, the attacker is going to be limited to web-based protocols for command and control. So they're probably going to be running like a hidden tunnel via HTTPS. Their discovery is going to fit a handful of different techniques associated with the domain. So they're going to be looking for details about the domain account, the domain trust, any group policy details they can pull up. They're going to try to discover services in the environment, shares, remote systems. They're just going to be, you know, poking and prodding around to find all of that stuff and ultimately try to find, you know, where is the data of interest in the environment? Are there network shared drives that they can pull data off of? Various code repositories, things like that they might be looking to access. And then ultimately that data will be staged locally on a system inside of the environment before they exfil it out. The lateral movement piece, again, they're going to try to use things like WMI, WinRM, RDP to move laterally. And then they're going to do this whole collection process again, right? And then ultimately end up exfilling it. And so these are the various techniques that all fall into each one of these categories, right? So the analyzing mitigations is basically, hey, what opportunities do we have to dive in and really understand how to detect this activity? So the command and control bit is, you know, can we detect the hidden tunnel in of itself? Are there persistent connections to unusual domains that we can use to key off on their presence? Any, you know, unusual LDAP queries for domain reconnaissance, excessive RPC calls, high volume of Kerberos ticket requests. These sorts of things all fall into the discovery bit. And then collection is, I mentioned that the traps earlier. So inquiry of fake accounts, accessing fake shared documents, large volumes of data moving around the environment, right? So these are the different detection capabilities that we can have in place from an AI-based or behavioral-based capability.
Tom, can I interrupt you?
Yeah, please,
For
go
a
ahead.
second? Sorry to interrupt you. I think we
Yeah,
have
no,
to
we're
move
up
on
on
with
time.
the time. So you have 1 minute if you want to wrap up, please.
Yeah, for sure. So that the attack scenario, this is what it looks like. And by the way, I'm pretty sure this deck will be shared for everyone, right? So feel free to come in and take a look at this. Ultimately, this scenario I put together, I built a playbook for, so you can check it out here under the custom playbooks link. Go take a look at it later. This is a playbook that you would run inside of Havoc that's similar to the scenario that I just walked through for this particular example environment. So hopefully that the process makes sense, at least, of using, that rapid threat model prototyping, structuring it around attack trees, and then mapping it to MITRE ATT&CK. It really gives you that opportunity to then define a playbook like this. And whether you're using Havoc or something else to do that, you can then use that playbook to go execute and actually test these TTPs in the environment. So I'll summarize with that and appreciate the time.
Thank you, Tom, for your presentation. Questions for Tom? Yes. I want to use the microphone. Yeah.
Hi, hello. Hi, I had a question. So you mentioned that you mapped the attack to the MITRE attacks, but how do you identify the specific attack type? And another question is, do you also consider use KPACK, MITRE KPACK, which is focusing on the application security to construct the attack tree? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll say, so I'll answer those in reverse order. So considering application security, I think the point here is, as you're looking at the different components within, within the scope of what you're trying to protect, you have to evaluate, are there opportunities for us to do efficacy testing in that particular scope? And so when it comes to application security detection or application security scenarios, if you have some kind of detection capability in place that is going to look at activity beyond, so when we're talking about application security controls, we're usually talking about a web application firewall or something of that sort, right? And oftentimes those tools will be very preventative oriented, right? And so if you have, the basic capabilities to, validate that the control mechanisms in that WAF are functioning properly, then fine, like test those, make sure that they're working as expected. But if they don't, what comes next, right? If the adversary is able to bypass the WAF, then what comes next? And so the question then is, well, what capabilities do we have behind the WAF? And that's where you need to start evaluating this, going through this process, do the rapid threat model prototyping, figure out what are the things that an adversary is going to access there, right? And then look for the opportunities to detect them when that happens, right? So hopefully that answers the question. It's not a super cut and dry thing where for this problem you do this, right? It's a very subjective and sort of art based in a lot of senses, right? So
thank you, Tom. So you will receive a plaque from UND. Thank you for your contribution for this CAR Symposium, and we appreciate it so much. Let's give a big applause for Tom.